how effective military action would be, on whether Iran is an existential threat, on whether the Iranian regime is rational, on all of these questions. So I think now the American, groups like AIPAC have pushed hard for sanctions, and I'm not necessarily. I think that there may be a case for these sanctions, but it seems to me the sanctions only make sense if they're coupled with diplomacy. I mean, the sanctions are causing a lot of pain to average Iranians. That's something that one has to factor into the equation. It seems to me that can only be justified if you think you're actually these are going to be sticks. I know the Iranians understandably don't like talks about carrot and sticks because it says, but it only makes sense if you also are willing to hold out something and say, we have a realistic diplomatic alternative here, so you can get out from under these sanctions and we can resolve this problem. So my concern with the position of some American news organizations is not necessarily that they're promoting sanctions, it's that they may be promoting their definition of a diplomatic deal may be so unrealistic, given that they essentially expect Iran to capitulate on everything, and the U.S. to basically give up nothing, that ultimately it's either a recipe for permanent sanctions, maybe permanent sanctions and an Iranian nuclear weapon, or war, which it seems to me all of which are bad. And that's my concern about, I think, the way in which some of the Jewish organizations seem to be defining this issue.
So, any last comments before we wrap up?
Yeah. Just to speak on that point, I think what AIPAC has done is, with the sanctions and with some of the other measures that have been advanced on Capitol Hill, has really boxed the administration in and boxed in, the United States as well as the European governments in terms of what can be acceptable in negotiation. Right now, next Monday, we're going to meet with the Iranians in Moscow with the other P5+1 states. And on the table is Iran ending its 20% enrichment, or at least freezing it, which would be an enormous non-proliferation gain. This is actually finally walking back Iran's program, and would be the first step in an actual resolution of this issue. It would satisfy our most immediate concerns. It would close the door on a shortcut by Iran to a nuclear weapon. And it's something that we should be pursuing and realizing that all of the sanctions that we have in place are leverage on Iran to actually make that concession. The problem is that the president doesn't actually have the space to use those sanctions as leverage. Because of the Congress, is unable to lift any of the sanctions. And we have more than enough sanctions in place that we can probably spare one or two on the fringes in order to accomplish this non-proliferation victory of ending Iran's 20% enrichment. But the Congress will never allow the president to do that. And Congress, at the end of the day, controls the sanctions, the central bank sanctions. The president can delay them for up to 120 days, but in order to waive them, he has to get Congress to pass a law. And Congress is not going to do that. Congress is also, there's a resolution that was actually AIPAC's top ask at its last policy conference, which would rule out the containment of a nuclear weapons capable Iran. Now, by making that U.S. policy, by making nuclear weapons capable the threshold for military action, we're setting the question of war on this tremendously shaky footing that actually hasn't been defined. Nuclear weapons capable is not a term that has a definition, per se. And a lot of people agree that it actually means enrichment. So at this point, Iran has actually crossed the red line for what Congress, at least the House so far, has voted to say is our red line for war. All that does is shrink the space and prevent the United States from being able to do what it takes to actually achieve the real goal, which is not to prevent nuclear weapons capability, but to prevent a nuclear armed Iran, and to take the steps necessary to do that. So I think that, while AIPAC has been successful in getting these sanctions put in place that have had an impact in Iran, and have largely, have been broad and untargeted and have largely hit the civilian population inside of Iran and made life difficult for ordinary Iranians. It is also something that does, weigh on the Iranian leadership and is motivating them to want to make a deal. But the sanctions, if they're just a testament to how tough we are, and we can't actually use them as leverage, they actually become self-defeating. And we're going to see the same thing that we saw with Iraq, where we had mounting sanctions that ultimately didn't punish Saddam. I don't think Saddam went hungry for a day while you had innocent people that he was ruling suffering constantly under them. And ultimately that didn't topple Saddam. Ultimately what toppled Saddam was the U.S. going in there and expending all kinds of resources. Now, when we talk about the Iraq War, I don't think that the Iraq War's legacy has been written yet. I think that it's still very much a question mark. So I would just say that it's not good for the administration not to have the maneuverability to actually pursue the policy that we want, which is preventing a nuclear armed Iran. And that's where I think that AIPAC's work is problematic.
Very, 1 minute, 60 seconds.
The only thing I would just say in closing is this is a lot on the right, on the hawkish side, a lot of the image of how you deal with aggression across a country like Iran is based on the Cold War. And this mythology that the way that we brought the Soviet, created democracy in the Soviet, the way we ended the Soviet Union was by taking an ultra-hard line. It's really a myth, and I think one of the biggest problems in this debate is that people don't remember that actually the thing that did more than anything else to lead to regime change in the Soviet Union was the fact that Ronald Reagan, in his second term, starting in 1985, was the most dovish president of the Cold War. Reagan, despite the fact that conservatives were tearing their hair out and saying that Gorbachev was another Stalin, in fact, Reagan actually made it easy, allowed Gorbachev to start to take the moves that ultimately allowed Eastern Europe to go free because he lessened the threat from the United States by radically changing his rhetoric and also by agreeing to very far-reaching arms deals in his second term. That was really much more significant in the reason that the Soviet regime collapsed than Reagan's very hardline nuclear buildup in his first term. And I think this is part of the misconception that so undermines the way we discuss things, that actually really engagement is the better path to regime change than isolation. You isolate a regime like Iran's, you're actually doing what the regime already wants, which is essentially keeping the world at bay because it's engagement with the world, which is the thing that this regime really can't withstand.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Jamal, Adi, and Peter Beinart, for your wonderfully stimulating, thought-provoking remarks. We really appreciate you coming and being here to be part of this really national and international debate. Thanks a lot. Thanks to Brian Emcraft and Seaver College for hosting and allowing us to be here. Please join us to continue the conversation in the hall with some refreshments, with there's a sign-up sheet. If you would, we really hope you will, some of you will be willing to participate in further discussions on this and other aspects of Middle East peace. Peter Beinart will be signing his books if you like. So please join us a little further, and thank you so much for coming.